Some years ago, an author had posted on their Twitter a quick piece of writing advice. And the advice was, coincidence is fine if it gets your characters into trouble. But if coincidence gets your characters out of trouble, you're cheating. Now, what they were referring to was the idea of the Deus Ex Machina, right? The idea of just your characters getting out of situations by convenience rather than by their own skills or their own merits. And so when it comes to coincidences and Deus Ex Machinas in your story, that's good general advice, right? Use the coincidence to get your characters into trouble. Use coincidence to set up your plots for your characters. But when it comes to relying on it, it's deemed bad because you're breaking the conventions of your story. When someone reads a story, there's a certain set of rules basically that they are abiding to. And one of the unstated rules is that your world requires your character to solve their own problems. It's sort of an implicit contract that you make with your reader. Whenever you open a book, you assume that what happens in the book is going to lead to something else. And by introducing a Deus Ex Machina, you are basically breaking that convention. You're breaking the rules that have been established between you and the reader. Now, this advice is all well and good, but I do think that, especially with Deus Ex Machinas and coincidence, they require a bit more nuance and understanding. So you have obvious examples of Deus Ex Machinas, right? The ones that simply feel like cheats. The most obvious one that comes to my mind is, the Wizard of Oz, right? Where the Wicked Witch is killed by water, but neither the audience nor the protagonist, neither Dorothy or the audience were aware that water would kill the witch, right? She just happens to throw the bucket of water, it accidentally splashes on the witch, and she dies. Right, that feels like probably the most egregious example of a cheat. But with the egregious examples of the Deus Ex Machina, I do think there are some that exist that feel very satisfying, in a sense. So, again, an obvious one for me would be the Lord of the Rings Two Towers film, where at the very end, Gandalf Deus Ex Machinas his way down a mountainside and saves everyone. Right? And it's powerful, and the scene works very well because it was foreshadowed. He had mentioned earlier in the story, on the third day, look to the east and you'll see me. And obviously on the third day of that battle there, you kind of recall right at the very end, oh, it's the third day and he comes down. And it feels good because the seed was planted earlier in the story for that. Which kind of brings me to my first point about Deus Ex Machinas, and it's that you can actually use them if you are able to plant the seed for it. If you can somehow instill in the reader this sort of thing of, hey, this is going to happen later in the story, wink, wink, and then when it does, it feels very satisfying. Obviously, you want to be very subtle with that. You don't want people to kind of pick up on it. But putting the hint of the Deus Ex Machina at the kind of towards the beginning of the story, at some point in the story, you're not breaking the rules of your tale, right? Because you're giving the reader the information that if they are clever enough to discern it, will figure that out. So you're not cheating. It's not a cheat basically. You're not breaking your own rules here. You're giving the premise and then the payoff at the very, very end. And so, as kind of a midway summary, you want to avoid the Deus Ex Machina whenever you can, but if you are going to use one, you need to plant the seed early on in the story or at some point in the story, so that way it doesn't feel like a cheat. But let's go a bit further now. Let's go beyond the ones that are well planted. And go to authors that have used Deus Ex Machina without any kind of hint and yet their work is still celebrated, right? This is where we get kind of like into the very nuanced stuff. So for me, the biggest example of this is Nabokov's Lolita, where the narrator is discovered. His attempts at his lust towards this young girl is found out by his wife, and right after discovering that, the wife's about to sort of reveal it. She runs out in the streets and gets hit by a car and dies, and the secret in the discovery dies with her. I mean, how does the guy get away with that, right? Like, how is Nabokov this celebrated writer, and yet he breaks one of the most biggest conventions of the genre, right? And not just that he breaks it, he has his one main secret discovered, and immediately it is saved by convenience, right? Like, how does considered, I mean, Lolita is considered one of the, probably the greatest novel of the 20th century. How does he get away with that, and how is he able to use that? And as far as I can kind of surmise, as far as analyzing it, I believe it works because the discovery isn't really part of the story. It's not the central element of the story. The tale isn't really about him hiding his secret. It's about his relationship with this young girl. And I think because the secret basically doesn't really impact the story for the reader, right? Like, you go into the story knowing this. I think that it gets away with it because the Deus Ex Machina was not really a means of keeping a secret. It was a means of setting up a plot device for Humbert's character and Lolita. It was a means of getting if you follow the story, it was just really the device to get the wife out of the way, so that way it's now just him as the only adult authority figure for Lolita, and that way, and their relationship can then go, like, the story can progress basically with just those two. So I think the Deus Ex Machina, although it's used conveniently to save the Humbert's secret, Nabokov wrote it basically as really just a means of getting rid of that character. So in essence, it's not so much getting him out of trouble. It's a convenient coincidence to get him further and further into trouble, because the story is going to go so much more downhill. It's going to evolve so much more later on as a result of this. And I mean, to be honest, I don't really have much more of an assessment of this. This isn't one of my vlogs where I'm gonna have a huge teaching moment. This is really a lot more of just kind of throwing an idea out there and more sort of analyzing it and letting it stick. But my point, I guess, is that even this writing convention can be broken. That even the use, even the conventional device of the Deus Ex Machina, while it's often shunned, if you are skilled enough and you can frame your story in such a way, you can get rid of it. And that in someone even as great as the most celebrated novelist, perhaps of the 20th century, even they use it. Even they have used this before, right? So it's more to get across the idea that if your writing is at a certain level of skill, if you know how to employ the device correctly, even you can, any one of us basically can get away with using it, right? It's a typical, follow the rules but break them sparingly. Well, if you're going to break it, you have to be really, obviously really, really top notch about it, and how you do it. And maybe it all is just a feeling. Perhaps it's just something where, you can't really you can't really quantify it, but when you read it, it just seems to get away with it, right? Perhaps the story is just so enthralling, perhaps the narrator is just so compelling, perhaps the plot is just so good that you don't really care. You as the reader don't necessarily care too much that a Deus Ex Machina is employed, right? You're not as concerned about that. And perhaps that's supposed to be the takeaway. Maybe that is the grand takeaway in all this. I don't know. But yeah, that was just my summation there on just my sort of ramblings, my thoughts about this. If you have any thoughts about Deus Ex Machinas or how to employ them, feel free to leave it in the comments below.